Welcome to Promethean Action's Saturday night class for February 22nd, 2025, with Will Wirtz. Know Your Enemy and Your Friends, the second part of Will's series on the four-power agreement, United States, Russia, China, and India, to finally put an end to the British Empire. So, Will.
Hi, Tony.
Hi.
Hi, all of you who are listening. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you again this evening. As you've undoubtedly seen, there's been a complete frenzied response to President Trump's discussion with President Putin of Russia and the subsequent meeting in Saudi Arabia between representatives of the United States and Russia, bypassing the European Union, bypassing Zelensky. And in large part, the reason for that is that none of those forces are committed to peace. So if you're going to have peace negotiation, those who are committed to perpetual warfare and even to World War III are not going to be the most productive participants in such a discussion. Furthermore, the issues that are being addressed here are not just the question of Ukraine, but more a broader agenda, including questions of defending the US dollar, peace in the Middle East. For instance, one of the representatives of the United States that partook in the discussion is President Trump's envoy to the Middle East. And of course, the meeting took place in Saudi Arabia. So President Trump has a much broader agenda in mind. And I think the reaction of the British, the reaction of many of the Europeans, and particularly of Zelensky, is that it is reflective of the fact that these nations in their current form do not have a community of principle with the United States, and that there's potential, that there is a great potential for a closer relationship developing between the United States, Russia, China, and India than between the current leadership of Europe, of Ukraine, and particularly of the UK, Prime Minister Starmer, for instance. But of course, the UK is not run by a particular prime minister. The UK is run by King Charles II and the British monarchy. And I would insist that in fact, although we are told that the British Empire no longer exists, the British Empire is indeed alive and doing its evil as it has for many centuries. And it continues to be the actual enemy of the United States of America, as well as much of the rest of the world, definitely Russia, China, and India. Now, what you have to understand is that the British Empire, as it emerged in 1763 at the end of the 7 Years' War with the Treaty of Paris, it emerged from two private companies: the British East India Company, which was formed in 1600, it got its charter in 1600, and the Dutch East India Company, which was chartered 2 years later in 1602. Although these two companies had an adversarial relationship for much of their history, there were three Anglo-Dutch wars that occurred in the period 1652 to 1674. But nonetheless, the two of these companies are really the spearhead of European imperialism throughout the world. For instance, the British East India Company, when it was chartered, was given a monopoly on trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. So that's virtually all of Eurasia. And the crown jewel of the British Empire became India. initially the Dutch and British East India companies fought over the spice trade. The Dutch pretty much dominated in that area, with bases in Indonesia in particular. They had offices in Japan. They also waged 3 unsuccessful wars in Asia. Two, I think, against China, wars against Vietnam and against Cambodia. But at a certain point, they were the dominant company throughout the world, and the British East India Company, therefore, at a certain point, decided to focus on India. Their initial base was in Madras. Then they gained Bombay. And then finally, in 1690, they set up operations in Calcutta in Bengal. And in the year 1690, you had the merger of the Anglo-Dutch system with the so-called Glorious Revolution, in which William of Orange and his wife Mary, who was British, assumed the throne of Great Britain. And from that point on, what you had was the establishment of the Bank of England, approximately 6 years later. Earlier, there had been an Amsterdam bank. These two banks are the origin of central banking today. All the central banks today are modeled on the Amsterdam Bank and on the Bank of England. The biggest stockholder of the Bank of England at the beginning was the royal couple, William and Mary. John Locke was also an investor in the Bank of England. And of course, also what was set up at the time were stock markets in Amsterdam when the Amsterdam Bank was formed in 1609, and then also in England. So the central banking system, stock markets, all were set up by the Dutch and the British. And at the time that the British East India Company was in operation, before they had completely taken over India and had done their damage to China, could you show the chart? I guess it's a chart of the percentage of GDP of various nations.
Just a minute. Yeah.
There. What you see is that in the year 1600, India was the second largest economy in the world. China was the largest. China had 29% of the total GDP, and India 22%. In 1700, China had shrunk and was at 22.3, and India was at that point the largest economy in the world, 24.44%. I should point, and you see the GDP of Britain in 1600, 1.8, and then 1700, 2.88. When Britain finally left India at the end of World War II, India's percentage of the world's GDP was 3%. And what was done to India by Britain was to destroy their textile industry completely, to destroy their shipbuilding industry, which was a significant industry, and to destroy their steel industry. They had crucible steel. So the British policy was completely destructive of the Indian economy, and also it had a similar effect upon China, particularly through its efforts to run opium into China. Now, let me just indicate what are the characteristics of the Anglo-Dutch imperial system as opposed to the American system. First of all, in the American system, we have national banking, where the sovereign nation state issues the currency according to our Constitution, and credit is extended to the domestic economy. In the Anglo-Dutch system, you have central banking in which no credit is extended to the economy. It's merely a control mechanism, particularly for bailing out banks and for manipulation through interest rate policies. The Anglo-Dutch system is characterized by free trade, and also freedom of the seas. This was put forward. This is originally a French policy of laissez-faire, which was picked up by Adam Smith under the guise of free trade. Also, Hugo Grotius, who was a publicist for the Dutch East India Company, put forward this notion of freedom of the seas and freedom of trade. The basic idea is that one can carry out a just war against any nation which resists free trade on the part of these predatory imperialist private companies. So if China resists the import of opium into their nation, then the exporter of opium to China can wage a just war against China for having violated the principle of free trade. The American system, on the other hand, is committed to protectionism. The British system has always been involved in drug trafficking, as evidenced, and I'll go through this in more detail, as evidenced by the 2 opium wars that were carried out against China. The opium was grown in India. It was then auctioned. It was controlled by the British East India Company. It was auctioned off to private traders who then exported it to China. And the money that was gained from the sale of opium was used to pay for the export of tea from China, which was the only nation in the world at that point which was producing tea, to England and to other places, including to the American colonies. So this is what the policy of the Anglo-Dutch system is. They were the original drug cartel. And obviously they had no concern for the productive powers of the human mind in the nations which they were subjecting to such drugs. Whereas the American system is committed to developing the productive powers of the human mind. These companies were also committed to slavery and racism. In India, you had a caste system which they aggravated. In slavery, there are numerous forms of slavery. There's chattel slavery. This was carried out by the Royal African Company of Great Britain. They were the biggest slave traffickers from Africa to the Western Hemisphere. But there's also other forms of slavery, including indentured servitude. For instance, when the British they make a lot out of the fact that they outlawed slavery at a certain point, but of course they defended the Confederacy, which was a slaveocracy during the Civil War, and they invented new forms of slavery in particularly in Asia in terms of indentured slavery and so forth. Whereas the American system is based upon the idea that all men and women are created equally in the image of the Creator. Therefore, they have the capacity for human creativity. As I indicated, with the destruction of industry in India, the Anglo-Dutch policy is to prohibit manufacturing where it doesn't already exist, or to destroy it in places where it does exist. And in the case of the colonies, of course, in North America, we were prohibited by law from doing anything other than the export of raw materials to Great Britain. And we were prohibited from manufacturing a single thing. So they destroyed manufacturing in India, and they prohibited it in the US colonies. The policy of the Anglo-Dutch system has always been for population reduction, both as a policy, but also as an effect of their policies. Whereas the policy of the American system is population growth and an increase in the potential relative population density of our own nation, but also of other nations. The policy of the British Empire historically has been to deny sovereignty. For instance, this is what the British East India Company did in India. They took over India, and you'll see that at a certain point they were the sovereign. Their intention was to become the sovereign power within India, and to carry out regime change on a grand scale. whereas the policy of the American system is national sovereignty. And in recent times, the policy of limited sovereignty was advocated by Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, in a speech in Chicago that he made in 1999, where he called for limited sovereignty and for central banks. Complete opposite of the American system of political economy. The British system is a policy of war, of perpetual warfare. And you see this with what the British East India Company did, with what the Dutch East India Company did. They have a policy of ongoing warfare. They waged 2 wars in Afghanistan from India. They waged 2 Opium Wars against China to defend their opium trade. And I mentioned the policy of war of the Dutch East India Company prior to that. Now, in a certain sense, the turning point was, as I indicated, the 7 Years' War. This was a world war. It was waged between the English and the French in India. It actually began earlier than the 7 Years' War. It was ongoing. It was also waged in North America, where we had what's called the French and Indian Wars. But the outcome of that war was that New France, which is Canada today, was ceded to Britain at the Paris Treaty negotiations in 1763. This was the point in which the British Empire consolidated itself as an empire, utilizing this sort of public-private relationship between the East India Company and other private companies that they had chartered, and the government itself. At all times, the British nation backed up the private company, and in many cases, the British East India Company actually contributed money to the government, and at a certain point, the government was forced to bail out the British East India Company, which I'll mention. Now, there was a tremendous debt which accrued at the end of the 7 Years' War for having carried out that war. And what the British were hoping is that they would be able to use their stranglehold on the Indian economy, and also the sale of opium to China, in order to pay for ongoing exports of tea and other items from Asia. But what happened is that, and let me just say that because of the debt, what they were forced to do was to impose taxes on the American colonies. And this began the process which led into the American Revolution. So you had the stamp tax, which was imposed. And this was, I believe, in 1765, 2 years after the Treaty of Paris. And this was the same year that the British East India Company won what's called the Devani, which was the right to collect the taxes in India, in Bengal. So they were the tax collectors in Bengal. And they controlled the production of opium. But all of this wasn't sufficient to pay the debt from the war, so they wanted to tax the American colonists. And they were forced to back off on the stamp tax. But what they did is they followed up with a whole series of other coercive measures: the Grenville Acts, the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, forcing the American colonists to pay for the quartering of British troops in North America. Then in 1767, you had the Townsend Acts, the Suspending Act, the Revenue Act, the Customs Collection Act, the Indemnity Act. And all of this, what they were doing was you were trying to use this money to pay for the war debt. And at the same time, they want to use that money to install and fund governors, judges, sheriffs, and other officials so that they would control the colonies through the government agencies and judicial system, as opposed to the colonies having any form of self-representative government. Now, an individual by the name of John Dickinson wrote a letter called "A Letter from a Farmer in Pennsylvania," and this was in response to these coercive acts that were being imposed upon the colonies. And what he wrote is that the intention of the British was to reduce the inhabitants to abject slavery, to sink them into slaves. And the basic idea here was that the purpose of what the British were doing in the colonies was to get, as in India, the subject population to pay for its own oppression. That was the basic thing. And what I'm trying to get to here is the way in which the British policy in India, China, and the United States was completely intertwined. Now, one of the things that the colonists did is they boycotted British East India tea. So at a certain point, there were 18 million tons of tea from China sitting in the warehouses in London as a result of the colonists' boycott. This is what's leading into the Boston Tea Party. So this was contributing to the bankruptcy of the British East India Company. Now, in 1769-70, there was a massive famine in India, because if you take land out of production of food and instead you grow opium, non-edible products, then you don't have the food to sustain the population. So in 1769-70, there was a famine in Bengal in which 10 million people died. That's 1/3 of the population of Bengal. And then 1772, there was a world financial collapse. This was in which 30 banks fell in a period of just 3 weeks. So this, and as a result of that, the British East India Company had to be bailed out by the British government. And so again, what the British did is they imposed the tea tax in 1773. This is following the financial collapse. And in order to make the colonists pay for the failure of their imperial policy in India and China. Now, so at that point, John Dickinson wrote something called the tea tax. And what he said was that explicitly the purpose of the tea tax and the other earlier taxes was to the benefit and the advantage of the East India Company, and that their design was to enslave America. And after he wrote this letter this letter on the tea tax, which was distributed by the Sons of Liberty in New York, the Boston Tea Party occurred just shortly thereafter. That was then followed by the coercive Act of 1774 against the colonists. And so all of the things which are listed in the Declaration of Independence as the abuses of King George III are directly result of this policy of the British East India Company. They were trying to sell their tea in the United States, and it wasn't just a question of a sale of tea. They were attempting to impose their policies on the colonists, just as they had in India, and were attempting to do in China. One thing that can you go to the picture of Robert Clive, please? No, I think that's there he is. Okay. He was basically head of the East India Company in India. And he was the one who moved forward duplicitously to take over India. At one point, he wrote that with only 2,000 British troops, they could take over India. This same individual also said that with 10,000 troops, they could take over China. And the same individual, Robert Clive, was under discussion in this early period before the American Revolution in Britain as a person who could be put in charge of British troops in North America against the colonies. So it gives you a picture of how what was really involved in the American Revolution was a fight in parallel with the Indians and the Chinese, all of whom were being victimized by the Anglo-Dutch imperial system, which had been established fully in 1763 with the end of the 7 Years' War and the conquering of India in particular. Now, during the American Revolution, let me read to you to just give you a sense of how aware the Americans were of what the British had done in India and that their intention was to do the same in the colonies. So this is John Dickinson, the T-Tax letter. He says, "Are we in a like manner to be given up to the disposal of the East India Company, who now have the assurance to step forth in aid of the minister to execute his plan of enslaving America? Their conduct in Asia for some years past has given ample proof how little they regard the laws of nations, rights, liberties, and lives of men. They have levied war, excited rebellions, dethroned lawful princes, and sacrificed millions for the sake of gain. They have, by the most unparalleled barbarities, extortions, and monopolies, stripped the miserable inhabitants of their property and reduced whole provinces to indigence and ruin. 1,500,000, it said, perished by famine in 1 year." And I can go on, but that's you get a sense of this is in America. It was well known. And for instance, in the year during the American Revolution in India, an Indian leader by the name of Hyder Ali invaded the Madras presidency of the East India Company, smashing the East Indian Company forces. And 2 years later, in honor of him, a U.S. Navy ship was called the Hyder Ali, and it defeated and captured a British ship, the General Monk. This is in the year 1782. So the relationship between India and America is very well is really established through this fight against the British. To give you another example, after the American Revolution, General Cornwallis, who was defeated at Yorktown by George Washington's forces, later became the Governor General of India, where he carried out policies which were an attempt. There's Mr. Cornwallis, which were an attempt to make sure that nothing similar to what occurred in the United States of America, or what was to become the USA, would occur in India. And later, at the end of the first Opium War against China, the treaty, which was the Nanjing Treaty, was signed on board the HMS Cornwallis. Now, let's go further in terms of our friends. There's much to do. There's a real freak out about the possibility of friendship being reestablished between the United States and Russia in particular. There's a long-standing relationship between the United States and Russia. This goes back, for instance, to Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He is the actual author of the portion in our Declaration of Independence, which calls for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Many argue that was John Locke, but that's not the case. John Locke wrote life, liberty, and property, including slaves. So it was Leibniz, and his works attacking Locke were in the libraries in Pennsylvania of James Logan, and also Franklin had access to these writings. Now, Leibniz met with Peter the Great on 3 separate occasions in the 1700s. So you have an individual who helped shape the American Declaration of Independence, also who met with Peter the Great in the early 1700s, in 1711, 1712, and 1716. And what he presented to Peter the Great was a plan to modernize Russia. And he was named an official advisor to Russia at that time. And his concept was that Russia could function as an intermediary between Western Christian civilization, that is Europe, and by extension, at that point, the United States wasn't formed yet, but by extension, historically, the United States, and China on the other hand. That's in contrast to the British historical policy, which was to destroy Russia, because the British always saw Russia as a threat to its control over India in particular. And so what they developed was something called the Great Game. We've a more recent expression of that was Zbigniew Brzezinski's Arc of Crisis, to surround Russia with an arc of crisis in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, in Central Asia, and Afghanistan, and so forth. That's the British game. It was put forward, by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a cabinet member of the Carter administration, but it is a British policy dating back to at least the period of the early 1800s. The British knew that the only way that the Russians could enter into India to liberate India from the British East India Company was through Afghanistan, through Persia in particular. And so they worked to prevent that from ever happening. Now, and if you compare what Leibniz put forward, Russia is an intermediary between Western forces, and today, by extension, the United States and China. What the British put forward was the Great Game. Another expression of that was Halford Mackinder's view, expressed in his Geographical Pivot of History in 1904. And the idea here was, again, to encircle what he called the heartland, which was Russia, with in what's called an inner crescent, which is what we've seen play out for such a long time against Russia. And this crescent would go from Europe, Eastern Europe, through the Middle East, through Central Asia, and include China, because of course what they wanted to do was pit China against Russia and vice versa as well. Now, I've already mentioned in terms of Canada, which also has freaked out about President Trump, that they were ceded. Canada was ceded to the British in 1763, taken away from France. And of course, to this day, the monarch of Canada is the King of England, now King Charles II, and it's run by King Charles II and his Privy Council. It's not independent. It's a British colony, and it's been used historically as an instrument against the United States. For instance, did you know from 1919 until 1930, the United States recognized Britain as one of its two major enemies. The other one was Japan, or potential enemies. And the United States, actually, the military developed what was called War Plan Red, which was a war plan which was finalized in 1930 for the United States to be able to defend itself against an anticipated attack by the British through Canada into our industrial heartland, through Detroit into Pittsburgh. And that's not that far off from today. That's at the point in which it was still recognized that Great Britain is our enemy, and that they have used Canada historically against the United States of America. Now, again, go back to the American Revolution. What did I referred to Peter the Great in terms of his work with Leibniz. Catherine the Great was the one who initiated the League of Armed Neutrality, which was instrumental in preventing the British from winning, suppressing the American Revolution. So it's Russia that saved our revolution at that time. I should also point out that in the American Civil War, it was Tsar Alexander II who deployed the Russian Navy to New York City and to San Francisco in order to prevent an intervention on the part of the French and the British in behalf of recognition of the Confederacy, which would have split the Union. So once again, Russia saved the Union. Now let me, and this was Alexander II gave an interview to an American by the name of Wharton Barker, and what he said is that the French and the British approached him and asked Russia to join with them and recognize the Confederacy. And what Alexander II said to Wharton was that he said, let me see if I have it here. I will not cooperate if France and if France and Great Britain proceed, he would regard it as a casus belli, a cause of war against Russia. Now, I would so the other thing which occurred in terms of Russia is that in 1801, the Tsar of Russia was assassinated. This is Paul I, and he was assassinated because he broke off relations with Britain and Austria also at that time, and he knew that they were planning to attack Russia. So what he did is he wanted to carry out a flank against the British East India Company by sending troops to Bengal, India, to restore the sovereignty of the Indian government and to drive the British East India Company out of India. He did deploy troops; they were on the way, but he was assassinated by a palace guard, which was under the influence of the British. And in fact, there was an early. I think I mentioned that there are other companies of the British Empire. Not just the British East India Company, the Royal African Company, but there was also a Muscovy Company, which was the earliest company. It was created in 1655. So the money for the assassination was conduited through the Muscovy Company, in a certain sense, an early NGO, to bring about regime change. And Paul I's successor called back the troops. That was his first action at that time. But what you see is that the Russians were committed to freeing India, and they worked, and as I've indicated, they've worked very closely with the United States to support the United States of America against the British, our historical enemy. Now, I want to also just stress that during the American Civil War, well, let me backtrack further. What you had, as I mentioned, you had after the killing of Tsar Paul I, you had a number of developments as part of this great game against Russia to prevent Russia from interfering with the British Empire in India. And this includes two Afghanistan wars. The first was 1838 to 1842. There's a second one which occurred after the Civil War. This was 1878 to 1870. You also had two opium wars against China to force the Chinese to legalize opium. That was the point, and to allow the British to set up shop in China, including going inland in China, which had been prohibited altogether. The first Opium War occurred when the representative of the emperor seized all of the opium and threw it into the ocean. It was the Chinese version of the Boston Tea Party, but in this case, it was it was the opium. And you had right after the first Afghanistan War and the first Opium War, which were 1838 to 42 and 1839 to 42, there was a war in Crimea. Right, Crimea. We're back in an area which recently was part of it's part of it. It went back to the Russians after the 2014 coup d'état against the constitutional government of Ukraine. Now, the Crimean War was in 1854 to 56, and the U.S. supported Russia in that war. We gave them food, we gave them arms and intelligence, and we also built a Russian warship in the New York shipyard. So, and I should point out that, again, it was not just the British who carried out the Opium Wars, it was the French. It was the British and the French. And it was the British and the French who wanted to recognize the Confederacy. So what you have here is, yes, Lafayette supported the American Revolution, but then there was the French Revolution, which didn't go the American way, and it resulted in a reign of terror. And throughout much of history, the French have not been on our side. They have been imperialist. That's why Roosevelt distrusted the French during World War II and thereafter. He said he would do nothing to aid the imperialistic ambitions of the French, the Dutch, or the British. That was his perspective. And Churchill understood Roosevelt's intentions. He told Roosevelt, everything I hear you saying would result in the elimination of the British Empire. And I'm not Prime Minister of Great Britain in order to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire. That was the British policy. This is not just something in the distant past. Now, in the I already said in terms of the American Civil War, what the role of the British and the French was compared to the Russians, who were our allies. Now, let me also just say that there's been the Russians have been quite open to the American system of political economy. For instance, back in I think it was 1843, Friedrich List, who wrote The National System of Political Economy. He was originally a German. He moved to the United States, became an American citizen. He worked out of Reading, Pennsylvania. And he, in 1843, met with the Russian finance minister, Graf George Ludwig Cancrin. And Cancrin promised him a position in Russia. But unfortunately, Cancrin died shortly thereafter. So you see the openness of the Russians to the American system. Leibniz was met with Peter the Great on a number of occasions and had a plan for modernization of Russian industry. List was promised an appointment in Russia by the finance minister, but wasn't able to realize that because the finance minister died. During the American Civil War, Lincoln's ambassador to Russia, this is Marcellus Cassius Clay, or Cassius Marcellus Clay. He said openly, in Russia, we have a friend. one of the reasons he said that is, well, Alexander II sent his fleet to defend the Union to New York and San Francisco. But also Alexander II, before Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation freeing American slaves, Alexander II in 1861 liberated 23 million serfs in Russia. So what you see is the fact that you have this cooperation between the Russian and the United States historically against the British, who are our historical enemy. Now later on, there was another case where an American was being appointed by and this was Alexander II once again. In 1878, Alexander II appointed Wharton Barker from Pennsylvania to construct Russian Navy ships. And then in 1879, Barker went to Russia to launch iron and coal mines, forges, and factories to industrialize southern Russia. And at one point, he received a telegram from the Tsar asking him to supervise the industrialization of southern Russia. But unfortunately, Alexander II was assassinated 3 days later. Later, Barker worked with China. This is in 1887, and contracted to create a national bank in China and to build railroads and telecommunications. That program was also sabotaged by the British. Now, if you think forward to the Second World War, there are a few things that are important to know. Roosevelt created actually it was Hoover before him created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, but it was Roosevelt who utilized it to develop the economy of the United States. He also created the Export-Import Bank. And the Export-Import Bank was created in, I think this was 1934. And the first Export-Import Bank, by executive order of Franklin Roosevelt, was to deal only with Russia. Later, he created a second Export-Import Bank, which could extend loans to other countries, which the Export-Import Bank did. But I think it's very significant that the first Export-Import Bank that he created was exclusively for Russia. Note also that in World War II, through the Lend-Lease program, the United States provided $11 billion to Russia for equipment to wage war against the Nazis. In today's terms, that's worth $250 billion. So the United States helped fund the Russian contribution to the defeat of the Nazis. And of course, the Russians lost more than any other people in that war. 27 million people were lost in fighting the Nazis. Far more than any other nation. I think China may have lost maybe 14 million people, and there were 100 million refugees in China, driven from dislocated as a result of the Japanese militarists. but Russia was the worst hit. So what I'm getting at here in what I've presented is that there has been historically a natural friendship between the United States, Russia, China, and India. One other thing I'll mention is Count Witte, who became the finance minister of Russia. He was the finance minister from 1892 to 1903. And just before he became the finance minister, he wrote a piece called National Economy and Friedrich List. This was 2 years before the first translation of Friedrich List's book, National Economy I'm sorry, national system of political economy in Russian. And then Witte in 1909 republished a second edition of his earlier brochure. And interestingly, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1992, there was a Russian journal called The Issues of Economics. And in 1992, this Russian journal republished Witte's essay on national economy and Friedrich List. 2005, the editor-in-chief of another Russian magazine, Expert, republished the National System of Political Economy, together with Witte's brochure, in an essay by Medvedev, who developed the periodic chart, entitled A Sound Tariff, which he had written in 1892, and which Witte also published. And the editor-in-chief of Expert is Valery Fadeev, an individual who's been an advisor to President Putin of Russia since 2019, an individual that the Biden administration sanctioned. So here you have someone who is actually publishing the works of a leading American system economist, Friedrich List, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he's sanctioned by the Biden administration. I would also point out that List's work was also published in translation in China in 1927, and then again in 1961. And the English translation of Friedrich List's work in 1885 was also widely spread in India. And List is regarded as the leading American system economist in India, even more so than Hamilton or Henry C. Carey. So the point I'm getting at here is we look at what's going on right now with the attempt to prevent President Trump from even talking to the Russians and establishing good relations with them, and similar attempts to prevent such discussions taking place also with President Xi of China. And you see that historically, America's best allies and friends, particularly in the case of Russia, which saved the Union on 2 occasions and helped us defeat the Nazis, they bore the biggest brunt of World War II against the Nazis. You see that these are our friends and potential allies. That doesn't mean there aren't differences between our countries. There are differences, particularly in the case of China. China is taking advantage of globalization and the deindustrialization of the United States. But that doesn't mean that we can't form a relationship with China, Russia, and India, because these 4, which have been in a battle with the Anglo-Dutch imperial system for well over 200 years, have the combined power to end that system, which, as I laid out, is a system of perpetual warfare and potentially World War III. Now, what Franklin Roosevelt told to his son Elliot is that the most important thing is to prevent an alliance between the United States and England after World War II against Russia. He said we have to prevent that at all costs, and he said that he was going to do everything he could to prevent that from occurring, such a division. But that's of course what Winston Churchill did with his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. And after he gave that speech, within a matter of days, his son Randolph Churchill told the American journalist Walter Lippmann, you people in America don't understand the British Empire. We dragged you into 2 world wars, and we're going to drag you into a 3rd. That's what he said. So it's quite lawful that the British have completely freaked out. It is quite lawful that Trudeau and the Canadians are completely freaked out. It is quite lawful that some of the lemmings who currently run the European Union are freaked out. Remember, the European Union, established by the Maastricht Treaty, was forced upon Europe by Thatcher of Britain and Mitterrand of France, who was widely regarded in London as their guy, as their agent of influence. And they did that as a precondition for the reunification of Germany. But as a result of that, what you got was a supranational institution, unelected, in which deprived every single nation of Europe of its national sovereignty. No nation of Europe controls its own finances or its own budget. That's controlled by the European Commission and by the European Central Bank. So they're not free. And so what's happening now is the US under President Trump is breaking decisively from breaking decisively from what the British were committed to, which is perpetual warfare against Russia. This great game policy. And the United States is reasserting its own independent foreign policy once again, and is willing to talk with Russia, China, and India. And if trust can be developed, we'll see what can actually happen. Ideally, what should happen is the creation of a new Bretton Woods system, credit system, which would replace the Anglo-Dutch imperial system and its financial apparatus in the City of London and the various international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. And I would just say, for instance, the British East India Company went out of existence after the Sepoy Mutiny in India, back in just before the American Civil War. They went out of existence, but they were taken over by the British Empire. After World War II, the British Empire didn't disappear; it just took a different form. That's always what they have done. They adapt, and they try to convince you that they don't exist, but that's the best way for them to be effective. And what they did after World War II was to create the British Commonwealth to maintain their influence. And what they also did is they moved to take over certain international institutions, particularly associated with the United Nations, contrary to the intention of Roosevelt in creating the United Nations. And what they also did is they moved to take over U.S. institutions and intelligence. The latter through the Five Eyes organization, which was Britain, United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. And of course, this institution was also involved in the attempted coup against President Trump during his first term in office. So, the important thing is to know that the British are our enemy. They continue to be our enemy. And the way they operate is in the realm of ideas. They control the world and they control nations and people through ideas, through the hegemony of certain ideas, whether that's climate change, whether that's free trade, whether it's the idea of limited sovereignty, whether it's the idea of a rules-based system in which the rules have nothing to do with anything other than they're arbitrary. They just have to do with maintaining British dominion. So the idea that we're in a post-industrial society, the idea that there are limits to growth, which is entropy, which is and all of the woke ideas which have become dominant in the recent period. Well, most of those began really with the rock, drug, sex counter-revolution of the 1960s. And they've just gone further. But that's really where it began. So what I want to suggest is we have to free the world from the Anglo-Dutch imperial system. President Trump is making some important first steps in that direction. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. Trust has to be built among these countries. There has to be the discussion and cooperation between them. And among the things that President Trump has said is he wants to defend the U.S. dollar. To do that, you not only have to remove sanctions, but you have to strengthen the U.S. dollar by making America a manufacturing power once again. You have to go back to fixed exchange rates and a gold reserve system through the creation of a new Bretton Woods system. And those four nations, as Lyndon LaRouche specified many years ago, have the power and should create an initiating committee to negotiate the creation of such a system. And that will replace the financial control which the British exercise, in addition to their mind control over the rest of the world. And remember what I said about the charter of the British East India Company. It was everywhere east of the Cape of Good Hope and everywhere west of the Straits of Magellan. It was a worldwide empire that they were operating, and that they continue to operate. So let me just end with putting up my book, if I could, Tony.
Sure enough.
I would just urge you to get a copy of this book and read it. It goes through in more depth many things I've been addressing in these classes. I would also suggest that if you're interested, that you purchase a book or books to give it to people in the Trump administration, people in the Congress, or other people in media who are trustworthy but would benefit by reading this book in order to circulate these ideas and to get this perspective out as widely as possible. So I thank you very much, and thank Promethean Action for this opportunity.
I just mentioned that Promethean Action will be sending a delegation to Washington in the latter part of March, and this is part of what we'll be bringing to the Congress and others in Washington.